Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. There's been a bit of a furor recently erupting over Twitter concerning statements that were made by a fairly prominent horror writer in the US. I won't name names. I'm not interested in sort of like a sort of dog pile situation or anything like that. I don't really want to tackle the individual as such because I don't know enough about him. All I know is the statement that was made because I've seen it. And I want to sort of unpick the statement in the interests of exploring a wider phenomena. The statement is one that will be familiar to most of you, I imagine, because it crops up again and again and again and again, as particularly recently and particularly from certain demographics. The man in question said something along the lines of, he wishes that horror fiction and particularly he referred to horror cinema. He wishes that horror cinema wasn't as politicized like it used to be in the 1980s and 1970s. Now, that statement needs a lot of unpacking. It needs a lot of unpacking because it is not a sincere statement. What do I mean by that? What I mean when I say that it's insincere is that the person making the statement isn't talking about what they proclaim to be talking about. What they're using is language to mask. They're using language of insinuation and suggestion to mask other perspectives and other agendas. What people mean usually when they say something along the lines of they don't want politics in their video games or in their literature or in their cinema, in their media in general, is they want the politics to refer to and to reinforce them exclusively. They want it to take a particular shape, basically. And they're not even talking about politics. Even the term politics itself is euphemistic here. What they're talking about is any even vaguely ideological resonance or reference. They want it to cater exclusively to them. It is ultimately the ideological equivalent of a temper tantrum. It's a 2-year-old in a sandpit throwing a temper tantrum because they've been forced to share the sandpit with other people, basically. They've been forced to acknowledge that other children exist. That's what it is. And the sandpit doesn't even belong to them in the first place, you know? That's what it is. It is nothing but a temper tantrum. An entitled temper tantrum at that. It's rather pathetic, I have to say. But it's an interesting statement because it's so wrong. Even on the surface, it's so wrong in terms of the assumptions of the statement. So he refers to specifically horror cinema of the 1970s and the 1980s. Now, this guy is a horror writer, so he must know something about the horror cinema of that period. One must assume that he must. And if you know anything about the horror cinema that was produced from, say, the late 1960s in the USA right up to arguably the late 1990s, there is this massive period where horror is, and I'm not talking just about art house horror, I'm not talking about like niche horror, I'm talking about mainstream horror cinema is massively politically, culturally and socially resonant. It is informed directly, it comments upon directly certain phenomena that's happening within US politics, US culture, and it's some of the very best, most resonant, most profound horror cinema out of the USA is produced from this period. I mean, it's difficult to determine with these things a particular starting point, but most people who are interested, they determine a beginning point at around the late 1960s, so around the point of civil rights, women's liberation, lots of things happening that are upturning the assumptions of culture, basically the assumptions of US culture and politics. You also have, of course, Vietnam, which destroys the faith that a lot of particularly young people have in the American dream and certain meta-narratives, certain cultural and political meta-narratives that were pervasive once upon a time. And what horror cinema of these periods does is that it sincerely starts to reflect and comment upon those phenomena. So you have things like Night of the Living Dead, for example, which is, you could write a fucking thesis on Night of the Living Dead, on how politically resonant it is, on how it metaphorically comments upon things like the civil rights movement, things like racial tensions, things like lynch mobs and the KKK, and so on and so forth. All of that imagery is there. You get a slew of Vietnam films around this era. You get a slew of Vietnam films. You get the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which directly refers to not only a period in US history where there are things like, for example, gas shortages, which is directly commented upon within the film, but also a certain creeping nihilism, a sort of moral nihilism and a desensitization to actual real-life violence, which is being caused by news media and whatnot. All of that is there within the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It is a sort of behind the picket fences, underneath the prescribed meta-narrative film. That's the point of it. You get The Last House on the fucking Left. The Last House on the Left by Wes Craven, which is the most Vietnam film you could ever imagine. Not only does it comment directly upon the creeping nihilism and amorality that is filtering down from governmental and military systems that are prepared to just slaughter people for their own agendas, but also the film directly recreates some of the news footage and the photographs that were coming out of Vietnam that were portraying the atrocities and the tortures being committed by US soldiers. It directly recreates those scenes within the film. It's such a stupid statement to say that the horror of the 1970s and the 1980s was not politicized, or was less politicized than it is now. It was powerfully politicized. The Thing, John Carpenter's remake of The Thing, is such an incredibly political film in the sense that it deals with, metaphorically refers to so many things that are happening within culture, within politics. You've got the lingering echoes of that sort of Reds under the bed that the original one comments on. The notion of the outside influence slowly transforming and changing someone who is familiar to you. That is a direct commentary upon Cold War paranoia. You also have sort of metaphorical references to certain biological and medical scares that were pervasive at the time, like cancer scares and AIDS and HIV. Cronenberg's The Fly, Cronenberg's Videodrome, Alien. All of these films have political resonances, commercial resonances, industrial, cultural. The statement is so absurd on the face of it. If you know even the slightest bit about the horror cinema of these eras, if you know the slightest iota about the horror cinema of these eras, the statement is so patently absurd, one can only take it as sincere. As rather insincere. One can only take it as an attempt to euphemistically state something else. And what the person, and indeed the people who make these statements, are actually saying is that they want it all for themselves. They feel as though they own these genres, these forms of expression, and that they want them to cater exclusively to them. Wah, 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 throwing toys out of the sandpit. That's exactly it. It is. You have to look, you have to have some degree of perspicacity. You have to have some degree of perception when you're dealing with these people, because they are dishonest. Don't get me wrong, they don't realize very often that they are being dishonest. It's not a conscious thing. It's something that they've learned to do naturally. They mask what they actually mean so as not to draw particularly vehement recrimination for it. That's what they're doing. So it seems a little less severe than it actually is. But what they're generally saying is they're sick to death of the genres and the forms and the media that they presume to own, incorporating or including other demographics, or just speaking to other demographics. They just don't like it. They want it to cater exclusively to them, to their assumptions. They want it to reinforce them and not to question them, and they want it to operate within their presumed parameters. I have heard and seen people make statements like, for example, Star Wars is a really good example. I have seen and heard people make statements like, oh, there's all these SJWs coming in and taking it over, and that's people don't like it. Well, first of all, it's not your playground. The assumption of entitlement and ownership over these franchises, these genres, is it's a severe delusion. You don't own this franchise. It may mean something to you, but you don't own it. Second of all, have you ever seen the original Star Wars films and looked at them in context and looked at what was influencing them? In the original Star Wars films, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're not profound, but they're sort of latter-day Vietnam films. There's a reason why Darth Vader's iconography is Nazist. Like, his entire aesthetic is derived from Nazi regalia. There's a reason for that. These people who presume total ownership of these franchises don't even fucking understand the franchises they proclaim to have ultimate authority over, to the point whereby they feel they can exclude other people from coming into their territory. It is a total delusion. You don't own it. You don't create it. You don't get to tell writers and creators what they can do with their material. Referring specifically to horror, I think what the person in question, the writer in question, was actually referring to in his little mini euphemistic tirade is stuff like The Babadook, stuff like Hereditary, stuff like Mother, stuff like The Witch, that particular breed of horror that's very prevalent at the moment, that's not just dealing with traditional issues, that's not just incorporating traditional forms or referring to demographics that have traditionally predominated these particular types of cinema. They're actually looking at very, very, very different issues now. Issues which are relevant to wider demographics, to ethnic minorities, to sexual minorities, to trans people, to, oh my god, women. My god, women are actually being spoken to by horror films at this point. There are actually horror films that are including women, written by women, directed by women, and are talking to women. Excluding the fact, by the way, that there are multiple female horror writers at the moment within written fiction who are completely dominating. They are completely dominating in terms of the quality of the work they produce, because it's so interesting, it's so new. I'm referring primarily to Georgina Bruce, to Laura Mauro, to Priya Sharma. Go read anything by them. Their stuff is so interesting, it's so resonant, it's so out of the ordinary, because for the first time there is space and there are platforms for people who have traditionally been excluded from these genres to actually use them to talk about what they consider to be interesting, and to express phenomena and concerns that are relevant to them. And this is what certain rather conservative demographics are responding to. They don't like it. They don't like it. This sense that other people are trespassing on their territory. But it's a delusion. It's a total delusion. You don't own this territory. It's not a territory at all. And you are not the king of it. The way I put it is, it's not your back garden and we're not trespassers in it. Sorry. You may not like it. You may not like it, but it's the truth, and it's always been the truth when you look back. I mean, Star Wars is one of the great examples of that. The people, like the sort of, the demographics that piss and moan because Star Wars now includes female characters and has prominent black characters. This franchise, which has included giant furry aliens and little green aliens and whatnot. I mean, honestly, the stupidity of it is insane, isn't it? The stupidity of it is absolutely insane. The myopia of it. It's always had this element of it's always had these resonances that they would consider to be SJW, that they would consider to be left-leaning, that they would consider to be somehow negative, somehow corrosive, somehow an assault upon them. There is a sort of narcissism involved here as well. There is a certain narcissism in the sense that they feel as though this stuff should cater to them exclusively. that they are the center of these universes, and if it doesn't cater to them, then they're being assaulted. There is some sort of mass conspiracy to undermine the territory that they own. And it's not the case. It's not the case. All that's really happening is either A, these franchises and media are evolving, they're expanding so that there is more space for people, and for people of wider perspectives and different demographics to comment, or it was always that open, and these people are just too blinkered and too entitled and too myopic to notice it. That's all. They operate within this sphere of delusion, which is self-contained, which is like a big ball with mirrors all around the inside, and that's where they squat, pissing and moaning at the outside world because other people exist. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And one of the key points I'd like to make about this is we need to understand that when they are making statements like, oh, I don't want politics in my video games, for example, oh, I don't want politics in my horror fiction or my horror cinema, they're not actually talking about politics. They're using the word because it's euphemistic. It has a particular resonance that masks what they really mean. What they're actually talking about is, oh, they don't like women. They don't like women trespassing in their territory. Icky girls, basically. They don't like queers or trans people. And if you really want to get nasty about it, insert whatever ethnic slur you like into that particular statement. It's obscene. It really is. It's totally obscene. It's obscene because not only do they not have the strength of their conviction, so they can't just state what they mean. It's obscene in the sense that they feel this way, that they operate under such delusion that they can make statements like, for example, that the horror cinema of the 70s and 80s was somehow depoliticized, when in fact it was the most trenchantly and fervently political era of horror cinema, arguably. It allows them to make patently absurd and false statements, and it's insane. It is absolutely insane. And we need to be able to take them to task on it. And the only way we can do that is by being able to be incisive. We have to be able to interpret what they're saying so that we get to what they mean rather than what they say, yeah? It's absolutely essential when dealing with people of this particular perspective or this particular ilk, because they are, whether they know it or not, they are deceitful, and they will operate in euphemism and in implication rather than making just outright statements that you can just rebuff on the surface, on the face of it. So you need to be able to interpret language. You need to be able to appreciate language on the level of metaphor, of insinuation, rather than taking statements at face value, because they don't operate at face value. Language generally doesn't operate like that. There is this creeping problem with literalism that I have, which is it's a disease. The obsession with literalism in both spoken and written language, and especially with reference to fiction, is a socio-cultural disease that is escalating. We are, as cultures, losing the capacity to interpret language on various different levels in terms of symbolism, in terms of metaphor and insinuation. And that's a real problem. It's a real problem because it leaves us defenseless against the likes of politicians, against the likes of corporate oligarchs and whatnot, and against absolute con artists, the likes of Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and whatnot. It leaves us defenseless against them because we can't unpick what they say if we can't understand that often what people say isn't what they mean, yeah? Or that people are often insincere when they use language. They use it to obscure rather than to state, yeah? Rather than to make a statement, they use it to insinuate the statement so as to insulate themselves against reprisal. And this is exactly what's happened here. I would argue that in any and all instances where you get the proviso, oh, I just don't like politics in my blah, 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 what they actually mean is that they are operating under a sense of entitlement and ownership, and they don't like the fact that whatever they're referring to, the franchise, the media, whatever, is now incorporating other people or is referring to other people or phenomena. They want it to talk to them exclusively and in the way that they demand that the creators talk to them, you know? It's the sense of entitlement is infantile. It's infantile. You know, most children grow out of this by about the age of 10 and start to develop a sense of selflessness, a sense that the world is bigger than they are. But there's also, I mean, there's something very personal in this. Basically what they're also doing is telling people how to write. They are telling creators and writers and artists and filmmakers, no, make it how I want you to make it. It's like, no, fuck you. Fuck you. If you want something that refers exclusively to you, that caters exclusively to your preconceptions and reinforces you, you go and fucking write it, yeah? You go and fucking get it published and made, yeah? I guarantee you it won't be very good, but go and do it, yeah? But don't ever presume to tell people what they can do in their own imaginations, because it won't end well. It will not end well, I can tell you. So, until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!